People only begin making plans for your home when they believe your voice no longer matters. That thought settled quietly in my mind as I stood in the middle of the living room my husband and I had built together nearly 40 years earlier. Afternoon sunlight streamed through the large front windows, warming the oak hardwood floors Harold had installed with his own hands one summer long before our son was old enough to hold a hammer. Every corner of that house carried a memory. The worn leather chair beside the fireplace where Harold read every evening. The hallway where our son David measured his height against the doorframe every birthday. The kitchen where Thanksgiving dinners stretched late into the evening because no one ever seemed ready to leave. To anyone else, it was simply a beautiful two-story house in a quiet suburban neighborhood outside Chicago. To me, it was the story of an entire lifetime. I heard laughter coming from the dining room before I walked inside, carrying a tray of fresh lemonade. David and my daughter-in-law, Nicole, sat together looking through photographs and home improvement magazines spread across the table. At first I smiled, grateful that they were spending another Saturday afternoon with me. Since Harold passed away 8 months earlier, their visits had become more frequent. They helped with groceries, changed light bulbs I could no longer safely reach, and insisted on taking care of small repairs around the property. I appreciated every act of kindness because grief has a way of making ordinary generosity feel extraordinary. As I placed the glasses on the table, Nicole picked up one of the magazines and smiled brightly. "This kitchen has wonderful bones," she said warmly. "With a few updates, it could become absolutely stunning." I laughed softly. "Your father-in-law always said the kitchen was already perfect because it always smelled like cinnamon rolls." Nicole smiled politely before turning another page. "The layout is beautiful," she replied. "I have always imagined opening this wall and adding a much larger island. It would make family gatherings feel so much more open." David nodded without looking up from the magazine. "That would probably look really nice," he agreed. Neither of them realized what made me pause. It was not the suggestion itself. Homes change over time. Families remodel. Paint fades. Roofs eventually need replacing. It was the quiet confidence with which they discussed changes to rooms that were still entirely my responsibility. A few minutes later, Nicole pointed toward the staircase leading upstairs. "The guest bedroom would make a perfect nursery one day," she said with an excited smile. "There is so much natural light coming through those windows." David smiled back at her before glancing toward me. "Mom, you have always said this house was meant for family." "It is," I answered gently. "It always has been." They both smiled, apparently satisfied with my response, and continued talking about furniture arrangements, paint colors, and future possibilities. I remained quiet, listening more than speaking. Their conversation never sounded demanding or disrespectful. If anything, it sounded comfortable, almost familiar, as though they had already spent countless hours imagining what life inside this house might someday become. I walked into the kitchen to refill the lemonade pitcher and looked out the window toward the flower garden Harold and I had planted together every spring. The tulips had begun blooming again, just as they always did. Harold often reminded me that gardens taught patience because nothing beautiful could ever be rushed. Standing there, I suddenly remembered the final weeks before he passed away. He had spent several evenings alone inside his study organizing documents and making quiet telephone calls. Whenever I asked what he was doing, he simply smiled and said he wanted to leave everything in good order. At the time, I believed he was preparing paperwork. I never imagined he might have been preparing me. Just then, the telephone rang from the hallway. I wiped my hands on a kitchen towel and answered without looking at the caller identification. The calm voice on the other end introduced himself in a way that instantly brought Harold back into the room. "Mrs. Walker," he said, "this is Jonathan Reed. There is something husband asked me to place in your hands when the right time arrived." Jonathan Reed asked whether I would be available to meet him the following afternoon at his office in downtown Chicago. His voice remained calm, respectful, and carefully measured, exactly the way Harold used to describe him whenever legal matters came up over dinner. I glanced through the kitchen doorway toward the dining room where David and Nicole continued talking about cabinet finishes and furniture placement as though they were simply passing the time. Their laughter drifted softly through the house, and for a brief moment I wondered whether I was imagining the uneasy feeling that had settled in my chest. "Is everything all right?" I asked quietly. Jonathan paused before answering. "Everything is in order, Mrs. Walker." There is simply something your husband instructed me to share with you personally when I believed the appropriate time had arrived. I looked once more toward the dining room before lowering my voice. I will be there. After we ended the call, I stood in the hallway for several moments with the telephone still resting in my hand. Harold had always believed there was a difference between keeping secrets and preparing responsibly. Whenever he organized paperwork inside his study, he explained that planning ahead was one of the greatest acts of kindness a husband could leave behind. At the time I smiled, believing he was simply being practical. I never imagined those quiet evenings would one day matter so deeply. I returned to the dining room carrying a fresh pitcher of lemonade. Nicole smiled warmly. "Everything okay?" she asked. "Just a phone call," I answered with a gentle smile. "Nothing urgent." She accepted the answer immediately before pointing toward another page inside the magazine. "I have always loved large picture windows overlooking a backyard," she said. "This room already has wonderful natural light." David nodded. "Dad always built things to last," he replied proudly. Hearing Harold mentioned so naturally warmed my heart. Yet something inside me also reminded me that memories and ownership were not the same thing. We spent another hour together talking about family vacations, neighborhood changes, and the flower beds blooming outside the kitchen windows. Nicole truly seemed kind. She helped clear the dishes before insisting I remain seated while she loaded the dishwasher. Watching her move comfortably through the kitchen, I realized she no longer behaved like a guest. She moved through each room with quiet familiarity, opening drawers without hesitation and knowing exactly where everything belonged. None of it seemed inappropriate by itself. Families naturally become comfortable inside one another's homes. Yet after Jonathan's unexpected telephone call, every small detail began settling differently in my mind. When David and Nicole finally left that evening, the house became wonderfully quiet again. I walked slowly from room to room before stopping inside Harold's study. His desk remained exactly as he had left it. His reading glasses rested beside a neatly stacked collection of legal folders. A framed photograph of our wedding day still stood in the corner beneath the desk lamp. I gently ran my fingers across the polished wood and remembered the countless evenings Harold spent reviewing papers there during the final year of his life. Whenever I asked whether he was working too hard, he always smiled and answered, "I just want to make sure you never have to worry." Standing there alone, those simple words suddenly carried a meaning I had never fully understood. The following afternoon, I drove into downtown Chicago beneath clear spring skies. Jonathan's office occupied the upper floor of a quiet brick building overlooking the Chicago River. The receptionist greeted me warmly before leading me into a private conference room with large windows and polished oak furniture. A single cream-colored envelope rested neatly in the center of the table. Jonathan entered carrying a leather portfolio and greeted me with genuine kindness before taking his seat across from me. He gently placed one hand on the envelope and looked directly into my eyes. "Mrs. Walker," he said softly, "your husband asked me to protect this until the day you needed it most. I believe that day has finally arrived." Jonathan remained silent for a few moments after speaking, allowing the weight of Harold's final request to settle naturally between us. The conference room overlooked the Chicago River, where afternoon sunlight shimmered across the water far below. Normally, I would have admired the peaceful view, but my attention never left the cream-colored envelope resting on the polished oak table. My name appeared across the front in Harold's familiar handwriting. The sight of those carefully written letters tightened my throat. For a moment it felt as though he had simply stepped into another room and would return carrying 2 cups of coffee with the gentle smile I had loved for more than 4 decades. Jonathan slowly slid the envelope toward me. "Harold prepared this almost a year before he passed away," he explained. "He instructed me not to deliver it immediately after his death. He wanted you to receive it only if circumstances suggested you might be asked to make important decisions before you were emotionally ready." My hands trembled slightly as I opened the envelope and unfolded several neatly written pages. Harold's handwriting was as steady and familiar as it had always been. The first sentence immediately filled my eyes with tears. "My dearest Helen, if you are reading this letter, it means life has placed you in a moment where everyone may believe they know what is best for you. Before you listen to anyone else, I want you to remember that I trusted your judgment more than anyone's, including my own." I stopped reading for a moment, taking a slow breath before continuing. Harold never mentioned David or Nicole. He never accused anyone of selfishness or questioned anyone's intentions. Instead, he wrote about grief. He explained that losing a lifelong partner often leaves people feeling uncertain, making it easy to accept decisions simply because others appear confident. One sentence stayed with me immediately. Never confuse another person's certainty with your own peace of mind. Jonathan quietly waited until I finished reading before opening the leather portfolio he had brought with him. Inside were several carefully organized legal documents dated nearly 11 months before Harold's passing. Your husband amended portions of his estate plan, Jonathan explained calmly. These revisions do not prevent anyone from inheriting property in the future. They simply ensure that every significant decision involving your home remains entirely yours until you freely decide otherwise. I looked carefully through each page while Jonathan explained every paragraph without rushing me. Harold had not created obstacles or complicated legal traps. Instead, he had protected something much more important: my independence. No one could pressure me into selling the house. No one could transfer ownership without my full understanding and voluntary agreement. The choice would always remain mine. I lowered the documents and looked across the table. Did Harold expect something like this? I asked quietly. Jonathan smiled gently before shaking his head. No. He expected life to change after he was gone. He simply wanted to make certain those changes happened at your pace instead of someone else's. His answer felt exactly like Harold. Throughout our marriage, he never tried to control my decisions. He always encouraged me to think carefully before making them. Suddenly, countless memories returned with remarkable clarity. The evenings Harold spent organizing files inside his study. The private telephone calls. The weekends he quietly reviewed legal paperwork while assuring me everything was simply routine. He had not been preparing for conflict. He had been preparing to preserve my voice when his own could no longer speak beside me. Jonathan carefully returned the legal documents to their folder before leaving Harold's letter in front of me. Take all the time you need, he said kindly. Your husband believed that no important decision should ever be made because someone else was ready. He believed it should be made when you were. As I folded Harold's letter and slipped it back into its envelope, I realized he had not left me a house as his greatest gift. He had left me the confidence to decide what that house would mean for the rest of my life. The drive home from Jonathan's office felt very different from the drive there. Only an hour earlier, I believed I was simply meeting an attorney to review paperwork Harold had forgotten to mention before he passed away. Now I understood that he had remembered everything that truly mattered. He had not left me complicated legal instructions or impossible responsibilities. He had quietly protected the one thing grief often steals from people without them realizing it: the confidence to trust themselves. I parked in the driveway and remained inside the car for several minutes, watching the afternoon breeze move gently through the maple tree Harold had planted in our front yard nearly 30 years earlier. Every spring he trimmed its branches himself, insisting that healthy trees needed care without losing their natural shape. Looking at that tree now, I realized people were much the same. They needed support, not control. When I finally stepped inside the house, everything looked exactly as I had left it that morning. Yet somehow it all felt different. Harold's reading chair still rested beside the fireplace. The framed family photographs still lined the hallway. The grandfather clock he inherited from his father continued marking each passing hour with quiet certainty. I slowly walked from room to room, allowing old memories to surface naturally. At the top of the staircase, I paused beside the bedroom window where Harold and I often watched summer thunderstorms roll across the neighborhood. We always believed this house would remain the center of our family, not because of its size or value, but because it held every chapter of our lives together. As I stood there, small conversations from the previous several months quietly returned to me. Nicole had often mentioned how much easier life might become if I no longer had to care for such a large property. She always spoke kindly, never forcefully. Sometimes she suggested that a smaller home would require less maintenance. Other times she admired the neighborhood and commented that young families would love a house with so much character. None of those conversations had seemed unusual by themselves. Looking back, however, I realized they all pointed in the same direction. David had changed more gradually. After Harold's funeral, he called every week and visited almost every Saturday. At first, we spent hours remembering his father, looking through old photographs and sharing stories that made us laugh despite our sadness. Slowly, though, practical conversations began replacing emotional ones. Instead of asking how I felt about living alone, he asked whether maintaining the property had become difficult. Instead of talking about future family holidays inside the house, he asked whether I had ever considered downsizing. His questions were never demanding. They simply carried an assumption that change was inevitable. That evening, I prepared a simple dinner before carrying my plate onto the back patio overlooking Harold's beloved flower garden. The tulips glowed beneath the soft golden light of sunset, while birds settled into the trees surrounding the yard. Harold often said gardens revealed the true character of a person because they rewarded patience instead of urgency. As I watched the flowers moving gently in the evening breeze, I finally understood why his letter had never warned me about anyone. He had not wanted me to become suspicious. He wanted me to become thoughtful. There was an important difference. Before going to bed, I unlocked Harold's desk drawer and carefully placed his letter beside the organized legal documents Jonathan had given me. I did not feel angry with David or Nicole. In many ways, I believe they truly thought they were helping me prepare for the future. What they could not possibly understand was that my future had never depended on how confidently someone else spoke about it. It depended on whether I was ready to choose it myself. As I quietly closed the drawer, I realized I no longer needed to explain my silence. Sometimes the wisest decision begins by allowing everyone else to believe nothing has changed while you calmly prepare for the moment when everything finally will. The following morning, I woke before sunrise with a sense of calm that had been missing since Harold passed away. The grief was still there, just as real as it had been 8 months earlier, but it no longer felt like the only voice guiding my decisions. Harold's letter rested safely inside the top drawer of his desk, and although I had already read every word twice, I could almost recite each sentence from memory. He had never told me what to do. He had simply reminded me that no one else should decide when I was ready. That quiet thought stayed with me throughout the day. I watered the flowers along the front walkway, trimmed a few rose bushes Harold had planted years ago, and stopped at the neighborhood bakery where the owner still asked how I was managing. Life looked completely ordinary from the outside, and I intended to keep it that way. Later that afternoon, David called. His voice sounded cheerful and optimistic. "Hi, Mom," he said. "Nicole and I were wondering if you would like us to come by tomorrow evening. We could have dinner together before meeting with Jonathan later this week." "I would like that very much," I answered. "It has been too quiet around here." He laughed softly. "Hopefully after everything is settled, life will become a little easier for everyone." I noticed the wording immediately. Not once did he ask what I wanted to happen. Like Nicole, he spoke as though the future had already chosen its own direction. "We will see," I replied gently. "Some decisions deserve a little more thought than others." He agreed politely, but I sensed he barely noticed the difference between my answer and the one he expected. The following evening, they arrived carrying fresh bread from a local bakery and a bouquet of spring flowers. Nicole hugged me warmly before placing the flowers in a crystal vase she knew was kept inside the dining room cabinet. Watching her move comfortably through the house no longer surprised me. She genuinely cared about our family. At the same time, she seemed increasingly comfortable imagining herself as part of the home's future rather than simply its guest. During dinner, our conversation remained lighthearted. We spoke about neighbors, upcoming community events, and memories of Harold that still made us smile. After dessert, however, the conversation naturally drifted back toward the house. Nicole looked around the dining room with an expression of admiration. "This home has so much character," she said warmly. "It would be wonderful to preserve everything Harold built while making a few updates for the next generation." David smiled in agreement. "Dad always wanted this house filled with family." Nicole nodded enthusiastically. "I have even been collecting ideas for restoring the kitchen without changing its original charm. We could keep the beautiful oak cabinets, but brighten the space with lighter countertops and updated lighting. It would still feel like home, only refreshed." She spoke naturally, almost absent-mindedly, as though describing plans for a project that was already quietly underway. There was no arrogance in her voice, only certainty. I listened carefully while sipping my coffee. Months earlier, I probably would have joined the conversation, offering my own opinions about wallpaper or paint colors. Instead, I simply smiled. The house has always taught me one important lesson: I said softly. It rewards people who never rush its seasons. Nicole smiled politely, perhaps believing I was simply reminiscing. The conversation moved on to other topics, and soon we were laughing together over old family vacation stories. After they left, I walked through the silent house one more time before locking the front door. Every room seemed to whisper the same quiet reminder Harold had left inside his letter. Sometimes the strongest decision is not made by speaking first. Sometimes it is made by waiting until everyone else believes the story has already been written. That evening, I placed Harold's letter inside my purse beside the folder Jonathan had given me, knowing the meeting ahead would reveal who truly understood what a home was worth. The morning of the meeting arrived beneath clear blue skies, and for the first time in many months, I did not wake with uncertainty waiting beside my bed. Grief still visited me every morning when I reached across the empty space where Harold had slept for more than 40 years, but uncertainty no longer came with it. Before leaving the house, I brewed a fresh pot of coffee and carried my favorite mug onto the back porch overlooking the flower garden we had planted together one spring after another. The tulips were fully open now, their bright colors stretching toward the morning sun without asking anyone for permission. Harold always admired that about flowers. They simply became what they were meant to become. As I finished my coffee, I quietly slipped Harold's letter and Jonathan's legal folder into my leather handbag before locking the front door. I paused for one last moment on the porch, looking back at the house. It had sheltered birthday parties, graduations, holiday dinners, difficult conversations, joyful celebrations, and ordinary evenings that eventually became my favorite memories. Whatever happened that afternoon, I knew one thing with complete certainty. This meeting was not about real estate. It was about preserving my right to choose what happened next. During the drive into downtown Chicago, David called. His voice sounded relaxed, almost relieved. "Good morning, Mom," he said. "Nicole and I are already heading over. Hopefully everything will go smoothly today." "I hope so too," I answered calmly. "Drive safely. I will see you there." He thanked me before ending the call. I noticed once again that he spoke as though today's purpose was simply to complete something that had already been decided. I no longer felt frustrated by that assumption. Instead, I felt grateful that Harold had quietly prepared me before anyone else realized preparation was necessary. Jonathan greeted me in the reception area of his office with the same calm professionalism he had shown throughout our previous meeting. Before David and Nicole arrived, we sat together for several minutes reviewing the legal documents one final time. Jonathan explained every page carefully, making certain I understood each provision exactly as Harold intended. There was no pressure, no complicated legal language beyond what needed to be explained, and no suggestion that I should reach any particular decision. When we finished, Jonathan closed the folder and smiled reassuringly. "Mrs. Walker," he said, "today is not about convincing anyone of anything. It is simply about protecting your ability to make your own choice." I nodded slowly. "That is exactly what Harold wanted," I replied. A few minutes later, David and Nicole entered the conference room together. Nicole wore a beautifully tailored cream-colored blazer and greeted me with a warm embrace before complimenting my navy blue suit. David smiled and pulled out a chair for me just as his father had always done. The conference room itself felt peaceful, with polished walnut furniture, fresh coffee arranged neatly along a side table, and floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking the Chicago skyline. Everything appeared perfectly ordinary. Nicole chatted comfortably about the beautiful weather, upcoming summer plans, and how wonderful it would be once everything was finally organized. Her confidence was gentle rather than boastful, yet it filled the room all the same. She glanced several times toward the neatly stacked legal documents already waiting on the table, clearly believing today's meeting represented the final step in a process that had quietly unfolded over the previous months. Jonathan entered carrying a slim leather portfolio separate from the documents already arranged before us. He placed it beside his chair without mentioning it, then calmly welcomed everyone before beginning the meeting exactly as any ordinary estate review would begin. As I folded my hands together on the polished table, I realized that every person in the room believed they understood how the afternoon would end. Every person except the one whose name still appeared on the deed to the house. Jonathan began the meeting with the same steady professionalism that Harold had always admired. He reviewed routine estate documents one page at a time, explaining each section clearly while allowing everyone an opportunity to ask questions. The atmosphere remained calm and courteous. Fresh coffee sat untouched near the center of the polished walnut table, while warm afternoon sunlight poured through the tall windows overlooking downtown Chicago. Nicole listened comfortably, occasionally exchanging quiet smiles with David. She appeared completely relaxed, almost relieved that everything seemed to be unfolding exactly as she had expected. I remained silent, listening carefully while resting my hands beside the fountain pen Jonathan had placed in front of me. Every few minutes I noticed Nicole glancing toward the signature pages waiting near the end of the folder. She did not appear impatient. She simply carried the quiet confidence of someone who believed the difficult decisions had already been made long before anyone entered the room. After nearly 30 minutes of reviewing financial summaries and property records, Jonathan closed the final folder already resting on the table. Then, instead of reaching for the signature pages, he paused. The room became noticeably quieter. Without saying a word, he lifted the slim leather portfolio he had carried into the conference room earlier that afternoon and carefully placed it directly in front of him. I watched David straighten slightly in his chair. Nicole's pleasant smile remained, although curiosity briefly crossed her face. Jonathan opened the portfolio and removed several certified legal documents along with the cream-colored envelope containing Harold's handwritten letter. He arranged them neatly on the table before speaking. Approximately 11 months before Harold passed away, he said calmly. He revised portions of his estate plan and left specific written instructions regarding these documents. David looked surprised. I do not remember Dad mentioning any changes, he said quietly. Jonathan nodded respectfully. That was intentional. Harold instructed me to keep these documents sealed unless Mrs. Walker first received independent legal guidance before making any permanent decision involving the family residence. He gently turned the first page so everyone could clearly see Harold's unmistakable signature at the bottom. The room fell completely silent. Jonathan continued speaking in the same measured tone. These amendments do not change Harold's love for his family or his long-term wishes. They simply establish that every significant decision concerning the home remains entirely Mrs. Walker's choice until she freely decides otherwise. No one interrupted him. There was nothing dramatic about the moment. No raised voices. No accusations. Only the quiet weight of truth settling naturally across the room. Jonathan then placed Harold's handwritten letter beside the legal documents. Harold also instructed that this letter remain private until today, he explained. I gently rested my hand on the envelope without opening it again. I already knew every sentence inside. David lowered his eyes toward his father's signature, and I watched understanding slowly replace uncertainty across his face. He recognized that handwriting immediately. He had seen it on birthday cards, Christmas presents, school permission slips, and handwritten notes throughout his entire childhood. Nicole looked from the documents to Jonathan and finally toward me. The confidence she had carried into the meeting slowly softened into thoughtful silence. She did not argue because there was nothing to argue against. Harold had simply protected my ability to decide for myself. Jonathan quietly slid the fountain pen closer to me before speaking one final sentence. Mrs. Walker, if you wish to proceed today, you certainly may. If you wish to wait, every document has been prepared to fully protect that decision as well. I looked at the pen for several moments before lifting my eyes toward Harold's signature resting across the table. In that quiet room, surrounded by legal papers and family memories, everyone finally understood something Harold had known long before any of us. A house could be inherited someday, but the right to decide its future had never belonged to anyone except the woman who still called it home. The silence that settled over the conference room lasted much longer than anyone expected. No one hurried to speak because there was suddenly nothing left to assume. Harold's signature rested quietly across the legal documents, saying everything that needed to be said without a single spoken word. Jonathan remained seated, allowing each of us the time to absorb what had just been revealed. I looked at the fountain pen lying beside my folder before gently placing my fingertips on it without removing the cap. Across the table, David slowly lifted his eyes toward me. His expression no longer reflected confidence or expectation. Instead, It carried the uncertainty of a son beginning to realize that the questions he should have asked months earlier had never been asked at all. "Mom," he said softly, "did you already know about these documents?" I nodded gently. "Jonathan met with me 2 days ago," I answered. "Your father wanted me to understand everything before making any decisions." David lowered his head slightly, thinking carefully before speaking again. "Why did you not tell us?" His voice held no accusation, only genuine confusion. I smiled with the same quiet patience Harold had always shown during difficult conversations. "Because your father believed that understanding should come before discussion. I wanted to understand what he had prepared before asking anyone else to understand it with me." David leaned back in his chair and slowly exhaled. I could almost see memories returning to him, memories of Harold reading every agreement carefully before signing it, reminding him that patience protected people from unnecessary mistakes. Nicole remained very still beside him. She looked down at the legal documents before quietly meeting my eyes. "I never meant to make you feel pressured," she said sincerely. "I truly believed we were helping you prepare for the future." I believed her. Throughout the previous months, she had never shouted, demanded, or threatened. She simply became increasingly certain that the future she imagined was also the future I wanted. "I know," I answered gently. "That is why this conversation matters." I slowly picked up the fountain pen and held it between my hands for several seconds. Every person in the room watched without saying a word. Then I carefully placed it back on the polished table exactly where Jonathan had left it. "I will not be signing anything today," I said calmly. No one interrupted me. "This is not because I reject the plans we have discussed. It is because I am finally making this decision for myself instead of allowing grief or expectations to make it for me." Jonathan quietly nodded, showing no surprise. "Mrs. Walker has every legal right to take whatever time she feels necessary," he explained professionally. "Nothing requires today's meeting to end with a signature." David slowly nodded in agreement. "I understand," he said softly. "I wish I had realized sooner that there was no reason to rush." Nicole folded her hands together and looked around the room before speaking once more. "I suppose somewhere along the way I started thinking about what the house could become instead of what it already meant." Her honesty filled the room with something far more meaningful than victory. It created understanding. I smiled warmly. "This house is more than wood, brick, and property lines," I said. "It is where your father and I built our lives. Someday its future may change, but that decision deserves to come from peace, not momentum." Jonathan quietly gathered the signed papers into their folders while sunlight continued filling the conference room with warm afternoon light. As I placed Harold's letter safely back inside my handbag, I realized nothing dramatic had happened. No one had argued. No one had been embarrassed. Yet everything inside that room had quietly changed. For the first time since Harold left this world, everyone understood that the true inheritance he protected had never been the house itself. It was my freedom to decide what home would mean when I was finally ready. When I stepped outside Jonathan's office that afternoon, I did not feel as though I had protected a house. I felt as though I had protected something far more valuable. I had protected my own voice. The warm spring air drifted through downtown Chicago, while people hurried along the sidewalks carrying coffee cups and briefcases, each living a story no one else could fully understand. I stood quietly for a moment beneath the afternoon sunlight, looking toward the river as it reflected the golden light across its gentle surface. Harold used to say that the strongest foundations were never built from brick or stone alone. They were built from trust, patience, and respect. Standing there, I finally understood exactly what he meant. As I started walking toward the parking garage, I heard David call my name behind me. I turned and found him standing alone a few steps away while Jonathan and Nicole remained inside, discussing a future appointment that would take place only if I chose to schedule one. David looked at me for a long moment before speaking. "Mom," he said quietly, "I owe you an apology." I waited patiently, giving him the same grace Harold had always given both of us whenever difficult words needed time to find their way into the open. "I spent so much time trying to solve practical problems that I stopped asking what you truly wanted," he continued. "Somewhere after Dad passed away, I convinced myself that making plans for the future was the same thing as helping you through your grief. I never realized those were not always the same." I gently placed my hand on his arm and smiled. Your father believed mistakes become lessons when people are willing to learn from them, I said softly. Today you listened, and that matters more than you know. Together we drove back to the house without discussing legal documents, signatures, or ownership. Instead, we remembered Harold. We laughed about the summer he insisted on building a backyard gazebo even after discovering he had measured one section incorrectly and had to begin again from the very beginning. We remembered how every Thanksgiving morning he filled the kitchen with the smell of cinnamon rolls before anyone else was awake, because he believed family traditions deserved as much care as family homes. By the time we reached the driveway, the house no longer felt like the center of a disagreement. It simply felt like home again. During the weeks that followed, I made every important decision slowly, exactly as Harold hoped I would. I chose to remain in the house because it still brought me peace, not because I feared change. Jonathan helped me update my own estate plan so that my wishes would always remain clear for the future. David began stopping by every Saturday morning again, often carrying fresh pastries from the neighborhood bakery before joining me on the front porch for coffee. We spent less time talking about responsibilities and more time sharing stories that kept Harold present in our lives. Nicole changed as well. She never again spoke about the future of the house without first asking how I felt. Our conversations became gentler, more thoughtful, and built upon respect instead of assumption. We never returned to pretending that certainty was the same as understanding. Instead, we learned something much healthier. We learned to listen before making plans. One peaceful evening, I unfolded Harold's final letter beneath the maple tree he had planted decades earlier. The garden bloomed around me exactly as it had every spring of our marriage, and the familiar scent of fresh roses drifted softly through the evening air. My eyes rested on the final sentence he had written in his steady handwriting. The greatest home we ever built was never this house. It was the life we created inside it. Protect that first, and every other decision will find its proper place. I folded the letter carefully, slipped it back into its envelope, and looked toward the front porch glowing beneath the setting sun. Harold had never tried to decide my future for me. He had simply made certain that when the time finally came, the choice would always remain exactly where it belonged, safely in my own hands. Thank you for listening and for being part of our community. If you enjoyed this story, please consider subscribing to our YouTube channel for more inspiring and thought-provoking stories.